So we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome everyone to our Find Your Ancestors session for today. I'm Katie Stilp. I'm the local history librarian at Appleton Public Library in Appleton, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar. Before we dive in, I do have a couple of quick announcements. I apologize for my voice. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. I've got a little bit of a sore throat, so hopefully you can all understand me okay. First, a huge thank you to the Friends of the Appleton Public Library for providing funding for our Find Your Ancestors series and allowing us to continue bringing amazing speakers every month. We definitely could not do this without their support. For those unfamiliar, our Find Your Ancestors series happens once a month, every month of the year. So check out the link in the chat, which has your handout. And on that handout, it's got some information on our upcoming sessions. So our last summertime slot is going to be on August 8th, where we're going to be discussing using website-generated hints more effectively with Sarah Cochran. And then in September, we go back to our regular school year time frame, which is Saturday afternoons at 2 p.m. Central. And we'll do that first session in September with Deanna Court discussing how to research those Swedish ancestors. So again, there's links in the handout for you to be able to register for those programs. We also have a beginner genealogy series that I teach through our local senior center called Thompson Center on Lords. So for those who live locally, you can join us in person at Thompson Center, but we also live stream those on Zoom for those who are virtual, and that's open to anyone. So those sessions happen on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Central, with our next session happening on July 23rd, where we're going to be discussing researching military records. So if you have any veterans in your family that you want to learn a little bit more about, definitely feel free to join us. And we also record those sessions and put them on our YouTube channel if you're not able to attend live. If you've missed any of our past Find Your Ancestors sessions, sometimes we are able to record them and post them on YouTube as well. So there is a link to our YouTube channel in the handout. Of course, not every presentation is recorded or available indefinitely. We are recording today's session, so I will send out an email tomorrow with a link to the recording if you need to rewatch any of it or if you need to leave early. Just a quick reminder that recording or capturing this presentation in any format without permission from our speaker and the library is prohibited. All the slides and handout materials are covered by copyright law. You are welcome to download and or print a copy of the handout for your personal use, but no portion of any material may be photographed, duplicated, or shared in any way without permission from our speaker. Then, if you have any questions during today's session, you can use the Q&A box, which is located on the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. We're excited to welcome back Melissa Barker. We've hosted her a few times in the past, and everybody seems to love her, so we're happy to have her back. Melissa is a certified archives manager and public historian currently working at the Houston County, Tennessee Archives and Museum. She is affectionately known as the Archive Lady to the genealogy community. She lectures, teaches, and writes about the genealogy research process, researching in archives, and records preservation. She conducts virtual presentations across the United States and other countries for various genealogy groups and societies. She also writes a popular blog titled A Genealogist in the Archives and is a well-known published book reviewer. She has been a professional genealogist for the past 19 years with expertise in Tennessee records. So once again, everyone, welcome Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me. I am excited about giving this presentation tonight, and I hope that you are too. I hope that you find this is something that you haven't thought about, and it gives you some new avenues of doing research. I do work in an archives every day, and so I get to see lots of great different kinds of records, and records that a lot of genealogists don't even think about. So we're going to talk about social and civic clubs, discovering your ancestors' community involvement. You may not have ever thought about the involvement that your ancestors did within their own community. And you should be. You should be thinking about that because there's records out there and we should be finding everything for our ancestors. So there's two photographs here on my front slide. You're going to see a lot of photographs and documents within my presentation. The majority of them come from my archives, Tennessee archives, or my personal genealogy records. And the reason I do that is because I love to include visuals, because I love to show genealogists just what's out there. So let's get started. Get this going. And first of all, your ancestors were not hermits. I find genealogists tend to think of their ancestors, especially those that lived on farms or lived in rural areas, as hermits, that they never went anywhere, they never did anything. And that is farthest from the truth. Here are some statements that I've heard genealogists say, and maybe you've said them. My ancestors lived in a very rural area. They never interacted with anyone. Well, that is very rare for that to happen. Your ancestors did interact with their community, with people, their neighbors. Maybe not very much, but they did. Maybe you think of something like this when you think about your ancestors and being out in the middle of nowhere. This is actually a photograph from the Tennessee State Library and Archives, their virtual archive. This is online. These are fields. These are farm fields from Robertson County, Tennessee, from about 1911. Now, maybe your ancestors did live on a farm, but I'm going to show you today that they did interact with their community, and there probably are records for that. Maybe you have said or heard another genealogist say, my ancestors lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere. They didn't get involved with the community. I guarantee you they did. Maybe they didn't do it as often as those in the city or those that maybe were higher up in social stature, but they did. And they did get involved in the community and they were part of their community. This is a photograph from my husband's ancestry. It is an unidentified photograph. We believe the gentleman that is by the mule there to the right is his great grandfather. We have not been able to identify him because his hat is down over his eyes. It's very difficult to see his face. But this is an example of a family during the Depression era, and they lived in a very rural area. His family, this particular family, lived in a very rural area. So maybe you have photographs like this that show your ancestors and family members living in very rural areas. Maybe you have said or heard genealogists say, my ancestors were boring. All they did was work, eat, and sleep. Well, I'm here to tell you that none of our ancestors are boring. In fact, we're doing our ancestors a disservice if we say that they're boring. I am a true believer in that anyone who's ever walked on the face of this earth has a story to tell. And we as genealogists, it's our job to collect the records, do the research, and tell their story. And I think that nobody's boring. They all did things in their lives, no matter if their lives were short, long, or they were farmers or they were executives. So we should be telling their story, and they are definitely not boring. So I like to show this picture postcard when I talk about boring ancestors. I actually do a whole presentation called Breathing New Life into Your Boring Ancestors. This is my great great grandmother. Her name was Ida Isidore. Her maiden name was Bonnier. She was first married to Mr. John DeBolt, who was my great great grandfather. And this is her second marriage to Mr. John Talbot Renault Loud. This was the first time I'd ever seen anybody with three given names: John Talbot Renault Ladd. Believe it or not, this is their honeymoon photo. They were married in 1915, and this is a picture postcard of them in Put-in-Bay, Ottawa County, Ohio. Now, I know that back in the day, photographers told people don't smile, sit very still, and don't smile. But when I think about boring ancestors, for some reason, this particular photograph comes to mind, and they're on their honeymoon. They do not look very happy, but a photograph is interesting to see. So here's another statement. My ancestors are so boring. Their records are boring. I wish they had done more exciting things in their lives. Well, if you don't go looking in the records to find this information, you may think that. But tonight I'm going to show you a lot of different records that are in archives everywhere that you can access. So if you think your ancestors are boring, in my personal opinion, I think you're doing your genealogy maybe not quite right, maybe even wrong, or maybe you're not doing it fully because we should be accessing any and all types of record sources to find information, stories, documentation about our ancestors, and even social and civic organizational records. This is actually a photograph from my own family photograph collection. This is our dog, Billy. He will be 11 years old in September, and this is how he likes to look outside. So, every family and every ancestor has a story to tell. Are you telling those stories or are you just collecting the dates and names? Now, if that's all you want to do, That's all you should do. I think every genealogist should do their own genealogy like they want to. But don't miss out on the stories. There is a story to tell with every single ancestor. And so using all of these different records is how we're going to do that. So this is another photograph from my family photographs. This is actually the Christian Barth family from the 1880s. They came to America in the 1850s from Germany and settled in Wyandotte County, Ohio. And they were a well-to-do family. As you can see from this photograph, I have researched this family for 34 years, and they have stories to tell. There are lots of stories to tell amongst this family, and some of those stories are being told from the records that I find in social and civic organizational records. Community involvement. All of our ancestors lived in a community, whether that was a big city in apartments or in a high rise, or that was on a farm or any other place. So they were involved in their community. These communities had churches, they had schools, they had stores, they had civic and social organizations. So they were involved. They were part of a community, large or small, in the city or in the country. And many of our archives, which there are thousands upon tens of thousands of archives in the United States, and then you get even more across the globe. There are archives out there. I like to say there's archives for everything out there. And so we should be looking for these records. So, did your ancestor live in this city? This is actually a photograph on the top of the Life and Casualty building in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. This is Mayor David Briley from 1963. And did your ancestor live in a city? When you think about them living in a city, this is downtown Nashville. It looks quite different today. I don't live too far from Nashville, Tennessee. They have done a tremendous amount of building, and so it looks a lot different. So I have ancestors that lived in Tennessee, in a city, and so sometimes there are different records to find when they live in a city. So we should be thinking about that. But then again, your ancestors could live on a farm. This is an unidentified family standing in a tobacco field. This is from Tullahoma, Coffee County, Tennessee, from 1915. They worked hard on these farms, just like any other farming family. And so, guess what? They produced records on this farm. It was very important to them, and not only financially, but in other ways to keep up with their crops, to keep up with how they ran their farms. And many of these records ended up in archives. So, whether our ancestors were rich, poor, or somewhere in between, they did interact with their neighbors and their community in various ways. And I think that many genealogists, without them even knowing it, they have records within their own genealogical records collections in their possessions. They're going to give you clues to the different organizations and community involvement. And so it may be a good idea to go back and revisit those records to look for those clues. For our communities, no matter where they are, for them to thrive and to grow and to prosper, they need people. And they need that people to be involved in their community, whether it was a small involvement or a large involvement. And that's where the records are going to come into play. This is a photograph from the archives where I work. And this is actually a photograph of a women's suffrage event that took place in the 1910s. You can't see it because of the trees, but behind those trees is our county courthouse. It's no longer there. They tore it down and built a new one in 1956. But this is a women's suffrage event. This is just one of literally tens of thousands of organizations, events, causes that many of our ancestors, men and women, were part of. And so we should be documenting that. So, social and civic clubs were formed in our communities for multiple reasons. And we're going to talk about those as we go through some of this. But there are many reasons why these organizations were formed, and many reasons why our ancestors may have gotten involved in particular ones. And so we'll look at that. So here's a photograph again from the archives where I work. This is a photograph from when they were establishing the Chamber of Commerce in our county. Wherever you live, maybe you have a Chamber of Commerce and maybe you're involved with it. But this is the Houston County Area Chamber of Commerce from the 1950s. And I want you to pay attention to what they have written on this pad of paper that they're talking about. So why do they want to have a Chamber of Commerce? And they want to have better recreation. modern community center, better horse show. Yes, in our community back in the day, not anymore, we had a horse show. And we have records in our archives about this horse show. A greater county fair. We still have the county fair here in our county, and many of you where you live, you have county fairs. So that's one thing that they were looking for. Improved highways, infrastructure was something that many of our communities worked hard at, and a lot of our ancestors were part of. Better living conditions. They were always trying to make their living conditions better. Industry. They were trying to get industry to come in. They list the steam plant and other heavy industry. The steam plant did come in. So it's one thing that they did accomplish. And then schools. Many of our people that were in our communities were always striving to have better schools. And back in the day, in many of our areas, there were one-room schoolhouses. And so your ancestors probably were involved in these schoolhouses. They would send their children to school. Maybe some of the men actually helped by delivering coal to the schools or chopping wood for the wood stoves that they had in the schools to keep them warm. Maybe the women actually took baked goods or even went to the schools and volunteered. So many ways to find out what our ancestors did within the community and find records for that. So let's talk about what are social and civic clubs, these organizations. So, what is a social club? I mean, this is probably straightforward, but let's talk about it. So, a social club is where a group of people who are formed around a common interest, occupation, or activity, and they join and they create a club. Many of you today are part of social clubs. So here's an example of that. This is the Memphis Chess Club, Memphis, Tennessee. This is a photograph from 1914. All of these men were part of the Memphis Chess Club. Why were they part of the Memphis Chess Club? Because they were interested in chess as a hobby. Maybe some of it saw it more of as a challenge, or they were very competitive, but they enjoyed the game of chess and they started a club. And so these are the members from 1914. Maybe you have ancestors that were in chess clubs or some other kind of clubs that are similar to this in the social realm. These social clubs have formed organized clubs and organizations. And guess what? As you know today, maybe they have officers that were appointed or elected. They have board members. And so these are people. Maybe your ancestors was an officer or maybe they were a board member and there probably are records to tell you about that. And just that will show you their involvement. Here is an example of that. This is the Houston County Lions Club from the 1960s. This is a photograph. This is when their charter night, they had just chartered their local Lions Club. And this is a photograph that actually was printed in our local newspaper. And what's even better about this photograph is they listed the names of those in the photograph. And so if you find something like this in an archive, a photograph that lists the names, maybe they were a founding member of a particular organization or club, that would help you to understand their interest. What were they all about? What were they passionate about? And so a great example. Here is the Rotary Club officers and members from 1950. This is when they tell you when it was organized, their charter when they chartered, and their officers and members. And what is on this document? Names. As genealogists, we're looking for our ancestors' names on documents. You're going to be able to find them in these social clubs and civic clubs in their records. So that's what we're looking for. These social clubs meet regularly to discuss their common interest. So, with these particular clubs, they are going to meet. And what do they do when they meet? Well, guess what? They're probably going to have meeting minutes. Someone who's probably the secretary is going to take minutes. What do they do with those minutes? They save those minutes. And in those minutes, they're going to talk about who said what, who's going to do what, which means there are more places we can find our ancestors' names. These social clubs also plan and carry out local events, highlighting their special interests. Whatever it is that their club has an interest in, they're going to have local events. These local events could be published in the newspaper. There could be programs printed about it that have been saved and you can find in an archive somewhere. And many of these social clubs collected these records, these minutes, photographs, programs, and then eventually they may have gotten donated to a local archive. So this is why we're talking about this. So here's a newspaper article. The Tennessee Ridge Community Heart Fund. had a Tom Thumb wedding performance. If you never heard of a Tom Thumb wedding, and Google it, you'll find out what it is. It was fun stuff. But this is from the 1950s, and they did this to raise money for the Community Heart Fund. And so when you read the article, you see that how much money that they raised, and there's names. There are people that were part of this particular wedding performance. It was actually like a play, and so there are people that play different characters within the play. And this is how you might find your ancestor being involved in this particular organization. So next, what is a civic club? They are different. And so you'll see that here. A civic club, they are a group of citizens who have voluntarily joined together to be concerned about a particular community affair. It's not all fun and games with the civic clubs. Civic clubs have a specific community concerns that they have joined together and developed a club. Here's an example of that. This photograph comes from the Library of Congress. It's free online for anyone to use. This is the African American officers of the Women's League in Newport, Rhode Island from 1899. This photograph actually is from the African American photographs assembled for the Paris Exposition. And they were part of this particular club because they had a particular interest and a particular civic interest in what they were doing. As far as civic clubs go, they have other objectives. They include preserving, enhancing, and planning for the general welfare, safety, and civic spirit of the community. That means many of these clubs help to feed the hungry, clothe the poor, help to house those who didn't have housing, just to name a few. Many of you know the difference between a civic and a social club, but the civic clubs were really, really the grassroots part of the community, helping their fellow man, helping them feed them and clothe them and house them. So here's an example of that. This is another newspaper article. This is the Houston County Business and Professional Women's Club. They were very instrumental in our community for just what I said, helping the hungry, feeding the ones that were hungry, clothing them, getting them housing. And so this particular newspaper article is about the 1974 Cancer Crusade. They actually had a crusade where they would raise money for cancer research and things like that. We have those today. So, but again, you have a photograph, and again, you have a list of names underneath that photograph. So newspapers, as you'll find, are very instrumental in helping you to find information about your ancestors that were part of these civic and social groups. So these organizations, these civic club organizations, they could actually have different levels. They may have a club that was at the local county or city level, but then they also have chapters, or they answer to a level at the state level or even at the national level. And so you might find that these clubs actually reported or sent their minutes into a state or national level, and that's also a place where you can find records. And so you might look to see if the particular civic club has a national chapter or group, and then they also had smaller chapters in the communities. But like social clubs, these members were volunteers. They were passionate about being in these clubs. They were passionate about what they were doing. Many of them paid dues to be in these clubs, which means there probably are records for when they paid their dues, or they paid membership fees. So again, there are records that are being generated for a lot of these different things, and a lot of these records truly do exist. Here's another example. This is the Phyllis Wheatley Club of Buffalo, New York from 1905. Again, the Library of Congress photograph collection. If you don't know anything about Phyllis Wheatley, I would encourage you to Google her name. She was a fascinating lady. She did a lot for her local community. And these ladies were part of a particular club called the Phyllis Wheatley Club in Buffalo, New York. So civic and social clubs came along even before there were government programs. There are many government programs that we have in place today that help the poor and the needy and those that are down on their luck or that need help. Well, before these government programs were instituted, we had churches and we had these civil and social clubs that helped those people. So there was a time before government programs that This is where people went to get help, whether they needed to pay their electric bill, maybe they needed milk for their babies, whatever it was, they went to a lot of these social and civic groups to ask for help because there was no other place to go. So our ancestors normally had to fend for themselves. There were no government programs that were helping them. Thankfully, we have a lot of these government programs today, but back then they didn't exist. And so they had to rely on the community, these particular clubs, these organizations, the churches to help them in their hour of need. So this is why many of these clubs were formed. They saw a need in their community to help. And so that's why a lot of them were formed. If you are ever fortunate to find that any of your ancestors were part of a particular club or organization, I would encourage you to read the history as to why they were formed. What were their purpose? What were they trying to accomplish? And I think you'll find that many of them were there to try to help those in the community. So many of our ancestors were also members of these programs, members of these clubs and organizations, because they had a passion for helping their fellow men and helping and being involved in their community. So let's talk about volunteerism. Volunteerism today isn't as strong as it used to be. I'm not sure why. I don't know about you, but I'm involved in a lot of clubs and organizations, and it's difficult to get volunteers to serve on boards or to be an officer or to just volunteer for an event. And so I haven't put my finger on yet what it is. I don't know if it's just isn't taught anymore or if it isn't shown by others anymore, or maybe many people are just so busy raising their families and trying to live day to day, they don't have time to volunteer. But volunteerism was very popular in the past decades. So many of our ancestors really didn't think twice about volunteering their time, uh, volunteering their whatever it is that they had in their home, volunteering to bake a cake, volunteering to make food for someone who is in need, donating blankets or things like that, and helping their fellow citizens in their community. Many people back then, you would hear them say, it's just what we do. They didn't think twice about it. They just did it because that's what they were told and taught to do. So that's just what we do. They also ascribed to the saying, "Do unto others." You'll hear many people back then say that, and so many of them will do this, and that's why they were involved in these communities and in these civic and social clubs. So volunteering was very much alive and well and being practiced by our ancestors. Have you ever thought about researching their volunteerism? What did they do? How did they volunteer in their community? We research so many aspects of our ancestors. I guarantee you haven't thought about volunteerism. I think that when you do research this aspect of your ancestors, it's really going to put a whole new light on your ancestors. I think that you'll understand them better. I think you'll see what were their passions, what did they care about? And it might even explain or help you understand some of the other records and things that your ancestors did during their lifetime. So, speaking of volunteers, we have volunteers that come to my archives to help us in the archives. These are just ones that in the past 13 years, we've had our archives open for 13 years that have come. Sadly, two of them have passed away. The other two are still volunteering, but we have volunteers in the archives and museum. Many of our local community archives are run explicitly by volunteers. Like I said, though, they're getting fewer and far between, but we have volunteers. And so you know yourself, either you are a volunteer or you know a place where there are volunteers. Celebrating their community and its people. Many of these organizations do just that. They celebrate their community, they lift their community up, they help their community and the people that live there. So I want you to think about your ancestors. Now, many of you will think about, oh, okay, I need to look at the men in my family who volunteered. Well, that's true. But you also need to think about the women and, believe it or not, the children. They all belong to the community civic and social organizations. There are all kinds of them. I mean, there are some that are nationally known. There are some that are just known within a particular state. And there are some that are very unique and only known within a community. But men, women, and children were part of these organizations. So men were typically, I'm going to say typically, not always, not 100%, but typically members of fraternal organization, farming co-ops, and other male-centric organizations and clubs. And you can figure those out. And so they would get together, especially if they were in a farming community, and get with like-minded men and join these clubs and organizations. So here's an example of that. This is a photograph from the archives where I work. This is the Lockhart's Chapel Farm Co-op men from 1885. Unfortunately, none of these men are identified, but they stopped to take a picture. And it is the local farming co-op, the men who were part of that co-op. And if you look, you'll see small children. Were they a member of the co-op? Most likely not. But their fathers were, or their uncles were, or their grandparents were, but they were in this photograph. Women, let's talk about women and their involvement. They were typically members of organizations that had to do with the home. Now, this has changed over time. Today, we have women that are part of civic and social organizations that have to do with business and other things that used to be male centric. So you have to change your mind as you come to recent years. But back in the day, they would be a part of clubs, organizations that had to do with the home, had to do with gardening, or had to do with taking care of their family, their children. And so those are the kind of organizations we want to be looking for. And here's an example of that. This is the Tennessee Ridge Canning Club from the 1910s. As you can see, these are all women, and they were part of the canning club. That's because that was their job, was to grow the food and can the food and feed their families. So you might find photographs or documentation about something like this in the community where your ancestors lived. Don't forget the children. I find many genealogists, just as an offset, many genealogists tend to start researching their ancestors when they get married, and then they research forward from there. Many of our ancestors had really full lives before they got married. They did things as children, they did things as teenagers, they did things as young adults, and we should be researching that and documenting it. So, one of the things that they may have done as children, they could have been part of local social or civic organizations. So, there were organizations specifically for children. So, don't forget the children. Here's an example of that. Many children back in the day were part of 4-H. 4-H is still going strong. And so many, I mean, my daughter, who's 34, was part of 4-H when she was younger. And so here's a newspaper article for District 4-H dress contestants. Their photographs were in the newspaper, their names in the newspaper. This is from the 1950s. And so this is one organization that particularly were for children. Here's another one, the Boy Scouts. We have the Boy Scouts, we have the Girl Scouts, we have the Cub Scouts and the Brownies. I was a Girl Scout when I was growing up. My daughter was too. But here's a photograph from the newspaper where they have Boy Scouts. They named their troop, 1969. And so yeah, and they name their names. So don't forget the children. We need to be researching our children. This particular document I actually found in a book. It's funny what people will stick in books. But when we have books donated to the Archives and Museum, I like to thumb through them to see what may have stuck in there. This is actually a Babe Ruth Boys Club from the 1930s. You could actually be part of Babe Ruth's Boys Club. This is actually a contest coupon. It's blank, which is kind of neat. But who knew that there was a Babe Ruth Boys Club? Maybe in your genealogical records, you'll find something like this. And then you'll have to figure out, well, which ancestor was it that was part of this particular club? But in this particular contest, what was the winner going to get? A Spalding Babe Ruth's fielder's glove. And so, what any child, whatever boy, would not want to have this? It was sponsored by ESSA, which was a fueling station. But this is a particular club that is aimed toward boys who loved baseball. Also, one thing that's very obvious that we don't think about is the children who worked on the annual, that was on the yearbook staff. Maybe you were on the yearbook staff, but many times their photographs were put into the yearbook themselves. Like I said, genealogists need to research their ancestors when they were children, when they were teenagers, young adults. Don't just start when they got married and go forward. There's lots of things that they could have done before they got married. So that's a little bit about civic social clubs, being involved in the community, volunteerism. So let's talk about finding the records. Not all archives are going to have the records, but you'll be surprised by what they do have. This is why I put this presentation together. I work in an archive every day, and there are records in my archive that genealogists have no idea are there. Not that the actual records themselves, but the fact that these particular types of records exist at all anywhere. And so that's why I'm always telling genealogists, ask the question, where are the records? What kinds of records are in the community? Because there are literally all kinds of records. So for many of us, our time, a lot of our time is spent trying to find the records. That is really one of our number one challenge. I was talking to a researcher today that had come to my archives, and we were talking about where to find certain kinds of records. And I told her, I said, half the battle is finding where the records are located, because sometimes these records are not where they're supposed to be. Many of these records are supposed to be in a particular city or a particular county or a particular area are actually being stored and preserved in a totally different place. So that's why we have to be very vigilant about where records are located and where these collections are. So we're going to talk about some record sources where you can find some of these social and civic club records. So number one is vertical files. This is not the most important records collection, but it's a records collection that I find genealogists either don't know that they exist or they're not sure how to navigate them. They're vertical files. Sometimes they're called subject files, or sometimes they're called morgue files. Almost all archives have them. You may not know that they have them because they're not normally out there in the research area where you're sitting. They're usually behind closed doors. You'll need to ask about them. So what are vertical files? Well, vertical files are a collection of records, documents, ephemera. If you don't know what the word ephemera means, ephemera are documents that are produced at a particular time for a particular reason. And once that reason is over, then normally they're tossed or thrown away. If they survive, we call them ephemera. So, for instance, if you had an estate auction and you produced a flyer for that estate auction, and that flyer was pinned up on trees or put inside storefronts, well, after the auction, they would normally tear it down and throw it away. Well, if it survives, we call that a piece of ephemera. So, vertical files are documents, ephemera, and even many times photographs and original records that are placed in file folders. And these file folders are stored in filing cabinets. And then there's an index. So this is an example of that. This is the surname Macaulay, Macauley, vertical file. And I took a picture of this to show you the variety of records that can be in this particular file. There's an original deed record in there. There is some family histories in there. There's some handwritten letters in there. So when you're opening up a vertical file, you just honestly do not know what you're going to find. That's what makes them so wonderful, is that maybe records in there that you can't find anywhere else. So these are going to be filed in filing cabinets, just like this one. One thing you're going to learn about vertical files is that they grow. As people donate things and we find things in boxes that we don't need to put in a large box for a collection, they end up in the vertical files. So this is kind of an older photograph because now we have 4 filing cabinets in our archives full of file folders full of records. They're also going to be labeled with either a surname or a subject name. And there's going to be an index. So either the index should be on the archive's website or on an in-house computer at the archives, or maybe you can email the archivist and ask them for their vertical files index. And so they will be indexed by surname or subject name. Well, now, when I talk about subject name, I'm talking about any subject, actually. It could be the name of a store, it could be a name of a church, a name of a school, an event that happened in the community. So don't overlook those subject names. Many genealogists go straight for those surnames, which I get it. But look at those subject names. There may have been something like a civic club or a social club that has a file in the vertical files. They're arranged in alphabetical order within the filing cabinets, and again, an index would have been produced. So what kind of records can you find in vertical files for a social or civic club? Here's an example. This is a newspaper clipping. Vertical files are notorious for having tons of newspaper clippings. So if you're looking for a newspaper item, it could be in a vertical file. So this one is titled Heads Women's Club. This is from an unknown newspaper. It's undated. It's a Tennessee newspaper. This is where Mary Hurt Satterwhite became the secretary of the Tennessee College for Women. And so this is a club. She says that it says that it's chapter of the Business and Professional Women's Club. Uh, this is in a vertical file under the Satterwhite surname. So if you were researching this particular surname, open up the file. This is something you would find. Here's another one. This is actually, I blew this up. It's only looks like it's about the size of a 3x5 index card. And this is the International Order of the Oddfellows, Lodge number 382. This is their constitution, part of their constitution on like a calling card almost. It says to the members of the Erin Lodge number 382, and it lists the secretary's name. And so if you're looking for information on this particular fraternal organization, mainly men were part of this organization, you might find it in a vertical file. Photographs. Now, I will say that about photographs, I have seen archivists do two different things with photographs when it comes to vertical files. Either they will allow the photographs to be in vertical files, but I've also seen archivists take all of their photographs and collect them together and put them in one photograph collection. So you just need to ask about that. Where are your photographs? Are they amongst the records, or do you have a photograph collection? So this is a photograph from the Pollard Home Demonstration Club from the 1960s. Again, this is a social club, and this would be one that mainly is for women. Next collection of records I want to talk about are manuscript collections. I feel like manuscript collections are the #1 underused records collections by genealogists. Again, they either just don't know about them, they're intimidated by them. There's a little bit of a learning curve to using them, or they don't know what to do with them. So let's first talk about what a manuscript collection is. I could give you a definition. I could give you an archives definition, but I'm going to give you this visual for you to take with you to always understand what a manuscript collection is. So I want you to think about all of the genealogical records, memorabilia, artifacts that you have in your possession. Maybe you have old family letters. Maybe you have scrapbooks, diaries. Maybe you have newspaper clippings. Maybe you have a quilt that your grandmother made or your mother's wedding dress. And maybe you have a lock of hair that belongs to an ancestor. Okay, I want you to take all of those materials and put them in boxes and then drive them down to the local archive and donate them. That is a manuscript collection. So that tells you literally anything could be in a manuscript collection. So a manuscript collection obviously is a various collection of documents, photographs, artifact, 3D, three-dimensional artifacts related to a person, a whole family, or an organization, such as a civic organization or a social organization. Now, other than the records themselves, one of the most important parts of a manuscript collection is the finding aid. So what is a finding aid? A finding aid is a document that is produced by the archivist as they process the collection. And in this finding aid, I would encourage you to read the entire finding aid, but you're probably going to hone in on the contents listing in that finding aid. And the contents listing is the folder by folder, box by box listing of what is in the collection. So it's going to tell you, is there old family letters? Is there a scrapbook? Is there a diary? What is in the collection? So here's an example of a small manuscript collection. This is a small family collection. The Lyle family donated this to our archives. So when I described a manuscript collection to you, this is exactly what I described. A little bit of everything is on this table. They were local mercantiles. They owned a store back in the day, and so they have a store ledger there, the bottom right. They have scrapbooks, they have photographs, they have newspaper clippings, they have receipts, invoices, programs, you name it, it's on this table. This is a manuscript collection. None of this stuff has been microfilmed. None of this stuff has been digitized and online. A lot of it is original, one-of-a-kind records. And wouldn't you love to find something like this for your family? It could well be out there, but you have to go looking for it and research it. Here's another one, and this one is a civic club. This is the Houston County Lions Club. I showed you a newspaper article and a picture earlier about this club. Why are these records in an archive? Why are they not with the club? Well, let me explain to you what happens. And many of you probably have gone through this scenario. As these volunteers become officers within the club or board members, many times if you're the secretary, especially if you're the secretary or the treasurer, when you become that officer, many times you're handed boxes of old records because the previous secretary or treasurer was also handed those boxes of records. It's handed from one volunteer to the next as they elect new officers and board members. Well, there comes a time where there's going to be an officer or a board member that goes, I have no place in my home for this. And so they usually will talk to their organization and say, can we please either get rid of it? They either throw them away, or hopefully they will talk to a local archive and donate them so that the records are preserved and can be accessed by the organization themselves at any time, but yet they are also available to researchers. So that's what's happened in this case. The Lions Club donated some of their older records. So you can see newspaper clippings, there's a program, there's information, there's membership information, which is key for genealogists. You might be able to find information about your ancestor and their membership. But the top right in that three-ring notebook is what I think is the most important part of these types of records. Those are meeting minutes. What are in meeting minutes? Well, the events, the business of the organization, and the names of the members and what they're doing. So meeting minutes are extremely important to an organization and to us as genealogists when we're researching these types of records. Here is one that I got several years ago, 2014. Our local county historian had passed away, and her son contacted me a few weeks later, asked me if I would like to have the research records out of her attic for our archives. Miss Nina Finley was our county historian for decades. She was one of those people you could mention a particular surname to, and 3 hours later, she is still talking to you about that family because she had so much knowledge. So, yes, of course, we wanted her records. It took 2 truckloads to get them to us. This is just a picture of a little bit of them. This is what I call fresh from the attic. This is how records come into the archives for the most part. So we have to go through them. We have to process them, archive them, put them in archival boxes, and get them ready for researchers. None of this is online. None of this is microfilmed, but it is open to the public and ready for researchers. So in these particular collection, it contained information on a lot of the civic organizations, social organizations she was involved with, but it also included a lot of membership lists, meeting minutes, because she was the secretary for many of our local organizations over the years. Here's what a completed, processed manuscript collection looks like. Well, they're in nice boxes, archival boxes. They're organized. A finding aid has been produced and ready for researchers. So when you are researching in manuscript collections, you need to read the finding aid, look at the contents listing. If you see something of interest, you'll probably need to request it from the archivist so they can bring it to you. But you should be doing research in manuscript collections. So the finding aid, I mentioned what the finding aid is. Again, it's the most important part other than the records themselves. It's going to be your roadmap to help you understand the collection and understand what's in the collection, because you need to know that so you'll know what you want to ask for. So here's an example of a finding aid, and it's a finding aid of a social club. This is the Tennessee Federation of Garden Clubs scrapbooks. This is a finding aid from the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and the finding aid's online. Many of our archives are putting their finding aids online, which is great for us. The records may not be online, but you can actually read the finding aid, figure out if there's something in the collection that you want to see, and then contact the archives about it. So this is a collection of scrapbooks from the Federation of Garden Clubs in Tennessee. And then as you look at the box by box, folder by folder description, it lists the different scrapbooks and the time frame that they cover. So if you have an ancestor that was part of this organization and you know they were part of an organization during a particular time period, you could actually go to the Tennessee State Library and Archives, reference this particular finding aid, and they'll bring you these records to look at. Next is diaries, journals, and calendars. If you're trying to find information about your ancestors' involvement in social or civic organizations, you might find them in their own writings. If you are very fortunate enough to have diaries for your ancestors, journals, or even calendars where they've marked meeting dates where they met with particular organizations, that will help you to know what kind of organizations they were a part of. So many of our ancestors recorded their day-to-day lives in these diaries and journals. Unfortunately, my family either didn't keep them or didn't save them because I don't have any for my family. The information contained in these one-of-a-kind records. Why are they one of a kind? Because they're produced by individuals, and every individual is one of a kind. They're unique, and they cannot be found in any other record source, the information that you're going to find. So most of the diaries you're going to find in archives are handwritten. They're various shapes and sizes. These are valuable records sources for genealogists. They're going to contain your ancestors' experiences, thoughts, but it's also could contain information about when they met with that particular club, what particular clubs they were members of. And so if you have these in your genealogical records, I would encourage you to get them out. If you haven't read them in a long time, read them. I'd encourage you to transcribe them. I know that when I transcribe documents, it helps me to really understand what is in those records better. So here's an example of that. This is Molly Cotton Smart's diary, dating from 1917 to 1926. And she has an entry in 1924 where she says, the whist club had a picnic at Fan Curtis's. Now, I have no idea what whist is. I think it's a card game, but they actually had a club, a social club. And Molly Cotton Smart was part of that club and she recorded it in her diary. And so maybe there are some records in the archives about this particular club. Maybe there's some newspaper articles about their meetings. So something to look for. Next is scrapbooks. I love scrapbooks. They're one of my favorite record sources to process in the archives and to also do research in. Again, my ancestors didn't leave me any scrapbooks, but we have several in the archives that I absolutely love. And you know what? These civic and social organizations, a lot of times they produced their own scrapbooks. So these are like time capsules. You just don't know what you're going to find in them until you open them. I have found original records pasted into scrapbooks. I've seen original birth certificates, original death certificates, original photographs, things that I have been looking for, and they're pasted into a scrapbook. So many of these organizations produce their own scrapbooks. Just a few weeks ago, we had 3 scrapbooks donated to our archives from the local business and professional women's club. And it is full of photographs, newspaper articles, and information about the club and those members that were part of the club. So here's an example of that. This is the Golden Agers scrapbook. This one's real recent, 1990. So see, it continues on. They do it. This particular club was for, let's just say, the ones that are a little bit older, those that were over 55. And this was under the umbrella of the local Methodist church. So see, I talked about churches and their civic and social clubs as well. So what was in this scrapbook? Well, they actually did events. They had excursions, they went on trips, and then they wrote about it, and then they had it published in the local newspaper, and they took photographs. So like I said, this is from 1990. They're still doing this. Here's another one. This is from the Retired Teachers Association. You may have ancestors that were part of a particular profession, and that particular profession has a club or an organization that they become part of, either while they're employed or after they're employed. And the Retired Teachers Association is one of those. So we have a local Retired Teachers Association club, and these are scrapbooks from the 1970s. Miss Laura Knight was actually part of that organization, and she took the pictures, she wrote the articles, and she created a scrapbook about it. And we have these in our archives. And you can see all the different people that were part of this. Next is newspapers. I love newspapers, and you can find so much information in the newspapers, but I would encourage you to read the newspapers. Don't just go on a newspaper website and put in the search bar your surname and think you've done a good search. I would encourage you to read newspapers from the first page to the last page. I have found so much more information from my ancestors reading the entire newspaper than I do using a search bar. So but many civic and social organizations, just like I showed you in some of those scrapbooks, reported on their events, on their meetings, on their members in the newspaper. Many times they had their own columns that would be there every time the newspaper was published. A great place to find information about the club and about your ancestor if they were mentioned. Here's an example of that. This is a Wisdom Lodge number 300. This is when they elected their officers in 1960. Again, there's a photograph, names to go with that photograph. And so maybe you could find something like this for your ancestors. Here's another one. This is when the local farm bureau was establishing a chapter in the local community. Remember me talking about some of these organizations have a hierarchy. They would have chapters at the local level, and then chapters at the state level, and chapters at the federal level. That's good for us as genealogists. Why? Because many times the local chapters had to report to the state level, or they had to report to the federal level, and that means it generated records. So again, there are men in this photograph and their names are listed underneath the photograph. And this is the Wesleyan Studies Guild. This is associated with, again, a church. Many of our churches had clubs and organizations associated with them. So if you know the church or the denomination that your ancestors were involved with, you may find that they were volunteering or part of particular clubs within that church. So, what kinds of records can you find for civic and social organizations? Well, it's going to depend. It's going to vary. Depends on what was saved, what's been archived. Many of these kinds of records are still sitting in people's attics and basements and closets. That's why I tell genealogists your genealogy is never done. As long as there are records sitting in people's homes, sitting in people's outbuildings, sitting in an abandoned building in town, your genealogy is never done. Don't ever give up on any of your genealogy because records may be found and then donated, and then you have the answer that you're looking for. So many of these civic and social organizations did generate records. So, what kind of records did they generate? Membership lists. Why would they generate an actual list of membership? Well, because they needed to keep up with who was a member and who was not. Also, they had to keep up with who paid their dues, who paid for their membership, because if they didn't pay, many times they didn't get the newsletter or they didn't get invited to the meetings. So they kept up with who paid and who didn't pay. So here's an example of that. Earlier in the presentation, I showed you a picture of the local Chamber of Commerce. Well, here's their membership list from the 1950s. And as you can see, it lists those who were members of the Chamber of Commerce at this particular time. Here's another one. This is from 1921. This is the Houston County's Growers Association. Remember me talking about farmers. Farmers were part of local farming organization clubs. This is one of those, the Houston County Growers Association. This is their membership list. And I want you to pay close attention to by some of these names. It says paid 50. They paid their membership dues, which were 50 cents. And so they kept these lists, and many times these records have been preserved, saved, and are located in archives. Organizational histories. If you find that your ancestor was part of a civic or social group, I would encourage you to research the history of that group. Why was it formed? How was it formed? Because and why were they formed? Mainly, why were they formed? What was their reason? What is their purpose? And that may have been what piqued your ancestors' ancestor and why they wanted to be part of that particular group. Again, organizational meeting minutes. We've talked about that. The meeting minutes can contain your ancestor's name and how they were involved in the organization. Meeting minutes normally have not been digitized, they're not online, and sadly, they normally have not been indexed. So it may be you have to sit in an archives and read through them. But they could contain information. So, how is this going to help you as a genealogist? Many times, if you have ancestors like I do that moved around from place to place to place, if you can find them in meeting minutes, you can nail them down to a place and a time. You know they were there at this particular time. Sometimes my ancestors moved around so much, I don't know where they were or when they were there. So these civic and social organization records can help you with that. So here's the Erin Business and Professional Women's Club meeting minutes from June of 1971. It tells where they met. They have their installation of officers. Miss Sarah Hart was elected membership chairman, and then it says program chairman were appointed for each month as follows. So each volunteer woman was appointed to come up with a program for each month, and it lists their names and what month they're going to do a program. So great information. Again, organizational scrapbooks, I talked about that at length. Many of these organizations produce their own scrapbooks. And what are in those scrapbooks? Photographs, information that could contain and include your ancestors. Event programs. Many of these organizations had local events. These events could have been covered in the newspaper, but they could have produced a flyer or an actual program that was saved with these organizational records. And they could list your ancestor as an officer, as a board member, or as part of the program. So here's an example of that. This is a 4-H rally event that happened in 1950, and it's listing you the times and what's going to be happening. They're going to right here. It tells you the devotional is going to be done by Reverend Lawrence Adams. The specials are the Arlington 4-H Club, and then the 4 High Club skit. They had a skit, and they list who was in the skit. Names, names, and more names. So that's why these records are a great find. So finding your ancestors in unexpected groups or organizations. This happened to me. You may not think about your ancestors being in particular groups or organizations because it just didn't make sense. So let's talk about those. Always look on the lookout for our ancestors in places that we don't think they belong. Sometimes I feel genealogists put blinders on and they feel like that their ancestors should follow this particular step and do this particular thing when they did their own thing. So it's quite possible that your ancestor is part of a club or an organization that doesn't make really sense to you, but at the time it made perfect sense to them. So maybe they were made an honorary member. They did not have the qualifications to be a full blown member in a particular organization, but maybe because of their contributions to the organization, to the community, they were given an honorary member. That happened to my grandmother. This is my grandmother, Agnes Marie Curtis Lemaster. My father was in the Air Force for 20 years from 1960 to 1980. And we lived in Oklahoma for 7 years. And my grandmother came to live with us in 1973 when my grandfather, who's there in the picture, died. She lived with us from the time I was 4 years old till a couple of months after I got married in 1988. And she was very much involved in the Altus Air Force Base NCO Wives Clubs. Well, the NCO Wives Clubs were for the non-commissioned officers' wives. She was not a wife of a non-commissioned officer. She was a mother. But she volunteered at the thrift store. She volunteered to do all kinds of wonderful things for the organization, and they made her an honorary member. So a great honor for her, but I have now records and information about that membership. Another one out of my own research, my mother didn't go to college, so why is she in a sorority? Many of us know that sororities are college-based organizations, and many of these clubs and organizations that were associated with certain institutions may have chapters for those not associated with that institution. So an example of this is a picture of me and my mother, one of my favorite pictures. And my mother was part of the Beta Sigma Phi International. If you ever want to do some great reading about a great organization, just Google this. This particular sorority is not necessarily part of a college. It is an independent organization. When you read their history, they have done some fantastic things. It was established during the Great Depression. Remember me talking about there's reasons why many of these organizations were established. There was a need for organizations that could bring women together and expose them to social, cultural, and educational climate that was not available in those difficult times. And so my mother was a member of this Beta Sigma Phi sorority. They called it a sorority. I can remember they used to meet in each other's homes when they have their meetings. And I dreaded it when they would come to our house because it was my job to dust everything for the women to come. And I did not want to do that. So what do I have? I have 2 scrapbooks for her. What they would do is that during the year, they would generate these scrapbooks, and then at the end of the year, they would give those scrapbooks to the outgoing president. My mother was president twice during her term with the sorority. So this is the first scrapbook from 1991 to 1992. And in that scrapbook is wonderful, great information. They would have women, they would have trips, they would do programming. This one is about women's health issues from September the 12th, 1992. And then they would make a scrapbook. Here's the second one that she got. This one is from 2005 to 2006 when she was president again. And so great, great information. When she passed in 2017, I inherited these scrapbooks, and they're a true treasure trove for me because it reminds me of her volunteerism and because they did a lot of great things for civic duties. I also have this. These are her sorority pins, her charm bracelet. And so maybe you have things like this in your genealogy materials having to do with your ancestors. If you have something like this, I would encourage you to research their involvement in those organizations. So, researching our ancestors' community involvement, their volunteerism, please put this on your to do list. I really do think that you'll find it will add to your ancestors' story. It will add to their character. It will add to your understanding of them. Any record we can find to help tell our ancestors' story is what we're looking for. So, thank you for attending this presentation. Please visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives. It's also on the handout, the link. And also, you can find me on Facebook. Just look for the Archive Lady. And if you want to email me, here's my email address. It's also on the handout. If we're all said and done here and you still have questions or comments, please email me. I love to hear from those who've attended my presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to see if we have any questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. I think everybody is so surprised at the wealth of, things that you can find in archives. I'm sure everybody's looking into what local archives they have near them to plan a visit.
Sure,
So we had a couple questions.
sure.
So first one was someone said their great grandfather was a Mason in Chicago, but they're unable to find the specific group within the Masons. Do you have any hints on how to find that specific group that they might have been involved in?
First of all, with any kind of research, I always tell genealogists to start at the local level. Look for a Masonic lodge there. If if there's no longer one in the community where he was living, I would check with the state. There are the Masonic Lodge actually reported to the state level. And so I would contact the state Masonic Lodge. And many times they had to report about their members' membership dues and their attendance and things like that, because I've actually gotten some of those records here in Tennessee from the state level.
So there were a couple.
And they can tell you what Masonic Lodge he was part of, the number and everything.
Good. There were a couple questions about like specific organizations. So what would you do if you have a name of a specific organization that your ancestor was a part of and you're like, I have no clue what archive would hold these records? What's the first thing that you would do to kind of get started to see if you're able to locate those records?
A couple of places online. I would actually go to Google Books and I would look for that organization through Google Books and read some of their histories. Because if you look at Google Books, many times it's not just books, it's also pamphlets and other types of publications. And it might tell you in the source citation where those are located, which might lead you to other records. Another place is Internet Archive. That's another place to look for these kinds of records. And you may be finding the records about the organization that doesn't mention your ancestor, but if you look at the source citations, where are these records located? They may be digitized and on the website, but where are they originally located? Then you might contact them and find more records. Another place is JSTOR. JSTOR is another place where they have these types of records. And so, but also, like I said, if it's a local organizations, check all of those local archives, historical societies. Talk to the historical society members. Historical and genealogical society members are very, very knowledgeable about what records are available, where they're located, and things like that.
Yeah, I'm throwing a couple links in the chat for those folks who are curious and want to explore some of those resources. So definitely look at those. Our next question, what do you do with things like scrapbooks that might be yellowing or falling apart? Like, are you digitizing them and then getting rid of them, or are you trying to repair them?
We do the least amount as possible. For me, in preservation, you do the least amount because you don't want to do any harm. And so in the archives, what we do with scrapbooks, we definitely don't get rid of them. Um, if they're falling apart, I actually have a scrapbook that's one of my absolute favorites in my archives. And what we've done is falling apart. Everything inside the scrapbook is pasted in there very, very well. I don't know what they used for glue back then, but we don't have it today. And so, but it's falling apart around the edges. So what we've done is we've taken and we've got an archival box, and we've put each page of the scrapbook in this box, and in between each page we have layered archival tissue paper. Now, we have digitized the scrapbook before we did that. We digitized every page. And that way, when we put it away, we can look at the digital copies and not touch the originals because the more you handle it, the more it's going to fall apart. So if
Mhm.
you have something like that, it's very easy. Just get an archival box, some archival tissue paper, interweave that archival tissue paper, but digitize it. Scan each page first to preserve it that way.
Yeah, great tips.
Oh, Archive Grid. There's Mary Reader's.
Yes.
That's another one. Yes, Archive Grid.
Yeah, and it'll show you locations too, which is really great, and
And
usually
archive,
link
yeah,
you to that archive, so you could go
archive.
explore their
Yes,
website.
Archive Grid is where many archives contribute. Not all archives, but many archives contribute their information to Archive Grid.
Yeah. I think those were all of our questions, unless there's any last minute questions. I know there were quite a few questions about specific organizations, but I'm sure off the top of your head you don't know, like, hey, how do I research the Odd Fellows, or how do I research this church organization?
Right.
You got to kind of follow the steps for every
Sure.
organization, because we have no clue where those records are going to be held.
Right.
Like Melissa explained, it could be at the local level, the state level, the national level. You got to do some research.
Yep. That's right. And if the organization no longer exists at the local level, that doesn't mean there's no any records. Because, like I said, many of these organizations had to report to a state region or a federal whatever, and so there could be records at that level.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So once again, thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing your expertise and all those wonderful examples. So many great organizations that so many people were involved in, and really prompts people to want to research their boring ancestors now,
Yeah,
to see that they really weren't so boring and that they
that's
were
right.
involved in their community a lot. So a lot of great tools that we can now explore to enhance our research. So
Absolutely.
again, everyone, feel free to join us next month, as we're going to be tackling researching, or yeah, using website generated hints more effectively. So that's going to be on Thursday, August 8th at 6 p.m. Central. So again, the link to register for that is in your handout. All right, everyone, have a great evening and stay cool.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.